young people. Well, Daniel 11, I think, would have to be one of the greatest prophecies in the Bible. When it comes to convincing interested friends about the authenticity of Scripture, about the control of God in the affairs of man, about the inspiration of the Bible, you might turn to Daniel chapter 2, because it's a prophecy which is pretty easy to understand, and it's a prophecy which forecasts, if you like, the next 3 to 4 world dominions from Daniel's day and forward. The day you ever want to take that discussion to the next level, I don't think there'd be any doubt. You've got to go to Daniel chapter 11. It is the most detailed prophecy that you'll find in the Bible. Well, you might disagree. Let me prove it to you. Here's the series. We've got to the end now. This is a prophecy all about the military phase of the kingdom of men. No surprise, of course, as a consequence of that, the last verses of Daniel chapter 11 from verse 40 onwards, we read in somewhat in a parallel way to Ezekiel chapter 38. And we describe these verses as having an application to the Gogian invasion of the last days preceding the advent of the Lord Jesus Christ, which we start to read about from Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. There's one other, and we're going to, of course, get to that this evening, which is why I've read the beginning and the end of the chapter. We're going to look at the chapter. I'll talk to you about the start. We'll talk about the end. But, of course, at 45 verses and at the detail that's contained here, there's too much to do every verse this evening. There's one other thing I want to mention just before we begin, and that's this. We've got a problem in Syria right now. That is, today, last week, next week, we've got a bit of a problem in Syria. Did they use chemical weapons or didn't they? And if they did use them, will they use them again? Will America attack them or won't they? And if America does attack them, what will Russia do? Daniel chapter 11 talks all about Syria. And it tells us in a fair amount of detail what we can expect to happen in Syria prior to the advent of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's a pretty interesting chapter, therefore, not just for doctrinal reasons, not just for historical reasons, but for contemporary reasons. So I'll tell you what I think is going to happen in Syria also, prior to the advent of the Lord. What does the chapter look like? This is what the chapter looks like. Here's the breakup of Daniel chapter 11. As I say, I'm not going to deal with the whole chapter. You can see there's a fair amount to talk about even in that breakup, but this is basically what the chapter is going to deal with. It starts in the kings of Persia. So Daniel's writing this chapter, and he was living at the time in the Persian Empire. It finishes up in the time of the end, as the phrase is described in verse 40 of this chapter, that time immediately preceding the second advent of the Lord Jesus Christ on the earth. And what you have in between is, for the most part, from verse 5 onwards, the great history of the Greek Empire. By verse 36 we get to the Roman Empire, but you can see from verse 5 all the way through to 35, the Maccabean Wars were wars against, for the most part, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, which was that division of the Greek Empire immediately north of Israel. So what we're saying is from Alexander, which we're going to read about in verses 3 and 4 here, all the way through to the end of verse 35, we have a description of the conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south, that is the northern and southern divisions of the Greek Empire in respect to the nation of Israel. You remember, after Alexander died, his empire was split 4 ways. Well, only 2 of those 4 divisions are of any consequence as far as Daniel chapter 11 is concerned, because they are north and south of the land of Israel, and they fought each other back and forth across the land of Israel. That's why Daniel 11 exists in the first instance. But it's a very detailed prophecy, and that's caused some problems for people. Here's Hastings' Bible Dictionary. Now, my point here is that here's a Bible dictionary, and as a consequence, you'd expect this Bible dictionary to be on your side when it came to expounding prophecy or when it came to speaking about the validity of prophecy. Here's what Hastings says. Chapter 11 of Daniel shows a clear acquaintance with minor events in Antiochus Epiphanes' reign and those of his predecessors. Now, I'll talk to you about Antiochus later, but just accept that it's talking about one of the characters in this chapter. In the veiled form of a revelation. What is that supposed to mean? In the veiled form of a revelation of the future, it gives an outline of history from the time of Cyrus to the death of Antiochus. So here's a Bible dictionary who says this is not really a prophecy, it's pretending to be a prophecy. It disguises itself as though it was a prophecy, but it's clearly not a prophecy at all, it's a history. The older commentators regarded these details as signal examples of divine prediction, of course. But since such a revelation of the future is without analogy elsewhere in Scripture, that is, there's no prophecy in the Bible like it, and without any apparent moral or scriptural import, debatable, this chapter or insertions in it are now allowed, even by those who regard Daniel as the author of his visions or the rest of the book, to belong to the period of Antiochus Epiphanes about BC 170. Do you understand what that's saying? Hastings Bible Dictionary believes that Daniel chapter 11 was written in about BC 170 after most of the events spoken about in the chapter occurred. Why? Because the detail is just too great for it to be written before the events happened. Too great. And therefore it must have been written after the events occurred. Now, I don't know how you'd square that with this book, with this prophecy being written by Daniel. They don't. They say it's clearly an insertion into the prophecy of Daniel. So here we have a Bible dictionary of all things saying that Daniel chapter 11 didn't get written by Daniel. And what's more, it was obviously written after the events it describes, because the detail is too great for it to really be a prophecy. Well, nonsense. Josephus, of course, lived in the 1st century. That was when he lived, between 37 and 100 AD. And Josephus records a little event that happened when Alexander the Great came to the gates of Jerusalem. Here it is here. Antiquities of the Jews, 11:8-5. When the high priest understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of citizens. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. So what Josephus says in the 1st century AD was that Alexander the Great was shown the prophecies of Daniel concerning himself, and as a consequence of that, he did not destroy the city of Jerusalem. Now, here's an interesting thing. Alexander destroyed every other city in Palestine. Why? Well, because they, for the most part, refused to submit to him. One of the legendary destructions he had, of course, was the city of Tyre, where he built the causeway out to the island city of Tyre. They wouldn't submit. He built a causeway out. He captured the city, crucified many people, took many others into slavery, and dragged the king, Abetus, the king of Tyre, behind a horse through the streets of the city. Why didn't he destroy Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem also resisted him at some point. Well, because, as Josephus suggests, when he got up to Jerusalem, they opened the gates. The high priest comes out and shows him the book of Daniel, and those prophecies in the book of Daniel concerning him, Daniel 11, speaks directly of Alexander the Great. There is no other reason that he didn't destroy the city of Jerusalem, because he destroyed most other cities that he came across. So we have prima facie evidence, therefore, from Josephus at least, of the authenticity of this chapter. Here's another one. The Maccabees. 1 Maccabees, chapter 2, verse 60, says that Daniel, for his innocency, was delivered from the mouth of lions. Now, the Maccabees were written in the late 2nd century BC. If parts of the prophecy of Daniel really were written, either not by Daniel or late, you wouldn't really have the Maccabees talking about, for example, Daniel 6 happening in the Persian Empire. My point is that in the late 2nd century, so let's call this 130 BC, for example, the Maccabees are writing the first of Maccabees, and they clearly believe that Daniel chapter 6 really happened in the Persian Empire. If large parts of the book of Daniel were written something like 170 BC, only 50 years before the Maccabees, they would not be saying things like that. What we're saying, therefore, is contemporary sources at the time of the Lord Jesus Christ or before, clearly believed Daniel was written when he says it was written, and that would include Daniel chapter 11. All right, what's happening in Daniel 11? Verse 1. I, in the first year of Darius, says Daniel, the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Now the I here that is confirming and strengthening Darius the Mede appears to be Gabriel. You read of the angel in chapter 10 and verse 20, and that angel is called Gabriel in chapter 8 verse 16 and chapter 9 verse 21. It's the first year of Darius the Mede, that's 538 BC, the beginning of the Persian Empire. And now, verse 2, will I show thee the truth? Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, shall he stir up all against the realm of Grecia. There shall be yet 3 kings, he says. Well, the current king, as you find from Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. Now, why do I refer to that? Well, because Daniel 10, 11, and 12 are all the same prophecy. The current king from Daniel 10, verse 1 was Cyrus. He would be followed by Cambyses, by Smerdis, by Darius Hystaspes, and the 4th great king would therefore be King Xerxes of the Persian Empire. Unquestionably, the wealthiest and most powerful king Persia ever saw in all its history. He would be far richer, the record says, than they all. Of course, he inherited the combined wealth of his predecessors. Cyrus took Babylon. Cambyses added Egypt. Darius Hystaspes formalised taxation in the empire and enriched it enormously, dividing it into provinces to collect tax. Xerxes inherited all of that. And Xerxes, it says, would stir up all against the realm of Greece. He would attack Greece. Well, what happened was that Xerxes' father, Darius Hystaspes, in 490 BC, lost his campaign against Greece at the Battle of Marathon, the basis for the marathon race now, when a messenger called Pheidippides ran a similar distance to tell him the Persians had come and they'd won the war. Well, Darius Hystaspes died a few years later, and on his deathbed he gets Xerxes, his son, to his side, and he says to him, "Listen, son, I want you to finish what I began. Go and deal with the Greeks." Well, 10 years later, in 480 BC, Xerxes invaded Greece. Herodotus says he put 5 million men across the Hellespont. The Hellespont, of course, is here, from Turkey into Macedonia. He put 5 million, well, whether Herodotus is right or not, 5 million is a very big number. But let's say a considerable number, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, he marched across land into Greece. Well, of course, he comes against Athens. The Athenians were no match whatsoever for the Persian army, both sea and land assault. What did they do? Well, they fled the city of Athens in terror, and they left it depopulated. So Xerxes comes up to the wall and there's nobody to fight him. He is furious. What does he do? He sacks Athens. He burns everything in Athens. He pulls down the museums. He pulls down the monuments. He lays it level like a plain. Well, that wasn't fighting fair as far as the Greeks were concerned. And from that point forward, therefore, they hated the Persians. They brought up their little kids to hate Persians, to hate Persians. One day we'll get revenge on the Persians. Well, one day revenge came. And in fact, it was about 150 years later in verse 3 of this chapter. All the subsequent Persian kings, you see, are ignored now, and we go straight to the retribution in verse 3 that the Greeks would take on the Persians for the destruction of Athens in 480 BC. A mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. That's not a Persian king. This is a Greek king. Here's the introduction of Alexander the Great. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. See, it is Alexander, isn't it? Because his kingdom was divided to the four winds when he died. And not to his posterity. His own children will not inherit his kingdom, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up for others beside those. And this is what happened. Alexander took off from Macedonia, having united the tribes of Greece after his father's death, Philip of Macedon. 21 years old he is. He jumps the Hellespont here and he comes into Persia, as we described yesterday. 10 years, 10,000 miles, following exactly the same route that Xerxes took, except in reverse, and brings down the Persian Empire, only to die about 10 years later at 32 odd years old in Babylon, most probably of the wounds he contracted during the wars. That was the conquest of Alexander the Great. Well, the consequence was, after his death, that his empire, you're familiar with this now, was divided four ways. And these were the four generals that by and by took over the realm that Alexander had left them. That's why you read in chapter 7 and verse 6 of Daniel that the leopard had four wings and four heads. But as far as we're concerned, and as far as Daniel 11 is concerned, we're really only interested in two. These two here. The northern and southern divisions of the Greek Empire with respect to the nation of Israel, called in this chapter from now on the King of the North and the King of the South. Interesting thing, by the way, it says in verse 4 that his posterity would not inherit his kingdom. Alexander did have a posterity. He did have a son, a little boy. You'll never guess what his name was. Well, young Alexander was left in the custody of Cassander, because young Alexander was back in Greece, of course, by the time his father, the older Alexander, died. Alexander had a wife. She was called Roxanne. Well, you know, Cassander has a bit of a problem with any of the former legacy still living, so he kills Roxanne and he kills young Alexander. The last thing he needed was, when the boy grew up, was a challenge to the throne that he occupied in Greece. So even though Alexander had a posterity, that posterity would never see any of the kingdom that Alexander had created, because that posterity wouldn't survive very long after Alexander's death, despite the apparent loyalty of one of his four generals. Well, verse 5 now begins the great conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. And it tells you in verse 5 that the king of the south, well, who's that? Well, that's this fellow down here, one of the Ptolemies, as I'll show you. The king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Now, it's a bit clumsily worded in the AV. Here's the NIV from verse 5. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he, and will rule his kingdom with great power. The king of the south, in this case, in this verse, is Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander's generals, and he inherited the area of Egypt. One of his princes, or one of his commanders, was a fellow called Seleucus Nicator. And Seleucus Nicator would become strong and have his own dominion. Well, what happened was this. Ptolemy Soter down in the south here he was now the emperor of the south, if you like, or the king of the south. He had one of his own generals, Ptolemy Soter. Ptolemy Soter was destined to become, Seleucus Nicator was destined to become the king of the north. He began life as a general of Ptolemy Soter in the south. That's what verse 5 is saying. Very simple. And Seleucus would become stronger. He would have a far greater dominion than the king of the south, Ptolemy Soter, you see. So the king of the north would become strong and have a great dominion. In the early years after the death of Alexander, there was a lot of fighting, you'll appreciate, between these four generals. As I've already mentioned, they began as 6, but they whittled themselves down to 4. And so they all had generals, they all had armies, and they campaigned against each other. The result was, one thing led to another. Ptolemy retains what he's got down here, and his general, Seleucus Nicator, takes the kingdom north of Israel. Verse 6. And in the end of years, they shall join themselves together. Who? The king of the north and the king of the south will make an alliance. That's what we're reading. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. So this is a political alliance sealed by marriage. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. Now you won't understand that any more than I did when I read it. Who are the he's and the hers and the hims and so forth of that? Well, it depends, and you've got to go through this line by line carefully with a history book at your right hand. But this is how it works. At the end of years, they shall join themselves together. The year was BC 255. 58 years, in fact, after Seleucus Nicator took over as king of the north. The northern kingdom is now in the hands of Nicator's grandson, a fellow called Antiochus Theos. So Antiochus Theos is now the king of the north in BC 255. The southern kingdom is in the hands of Ptolemy Soter's son, a fellow called Ptolemy Philadelphus. And things were hostile between them, so they made a peace treaty. And there's going to be a marriage between the families. And this is what the family looks like. Here's the family down in Egypt of the king of the south. Ptolemy Philadelphus is the king of the south. And here's the family in Syria. That's interesting. In Syria, in the north, this is the family of the king of the north. Antiochus Soter is the king of the north, the grandson of Seleucus Nicator, who we mentioned just a moment ago. What happens? Well, the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north. There's the king's daughter of the south, Berenice. And she's going to come to the king of the north. Sorry, I said he was the king of the north. Antiochus Theos is now the king of the north. The king's daughter of the south, Berenice, is going to marry Antiochus Theos, the king of the north. Well, there's only one problem, as I think you can see. Antiochus Theos is already married. He's married to a girl called Laodice, who gave her name to which famous city in the Bible? Laodicea, of course. Well, what's the solution to this problem? You can't have two wives, or easy, just divorce that one and marry that one. Boom, boom, done. Very clean, tidy. No problem. Well, no problem, but you've just upset this lady here. Let me tell you, she's a pretty wicked piece of work. Well, okay, so she bears it for a moment, this Laodice. She bears it. The king's daughter of the south is Berenice. She comes to the king of the north. It was agreed that Antiochus Theos would put away his wife Laodice and he would marry Berenice. That all happens. But she shall not retain the power of her arm. Berenice retains influence over Antiochus Theos so long as her arm, her father, is alive, because that was the reason for the deal. As soon as Ptolemy Philadelphus dies, Antiochus Theos divorces Berenice and remarries or takes back Laodice. But not so fast. Neither shall he stand, nor his arm. He's made a big mistake, kicking her out in the first place. He won't stand because he's done that. Laodice poisons Antiochus Theos for what he's now done. And she's going to poison the young son that's the product of her former husband and his new wife. Laodice kills Antiochus Theos and kills the son. Why? Well, because she's got her own son, Callinicus, and she wants him to be the next king of the north. Very, very simple. Well, both of those things happen. And so it tells you in verse 6 that she shall be given up. That is, Berenice was killed by Laodice, and they that brought her, the entire Egyptian escort of attendants that accompanied Berenice, were all likewise executed. and he that begat her, or as it ought to be, as your margin says, he who she brought forth. That's this young boy here, Berenice's son. He's also killed by Laodice. And he that strengthened her, Antiochus is killed as well. What does she do? Well, she wipes out her ex-husband, or her now husband, his other wife, the product of that union, and all the Egyptian entourage that Berenice had. She just kills the whole lot. And there's only one boy left, her son, who now becomes the king of the north. Well, what do you think the reaction to that was back in Egypt? Not good. Not good. But, verse 7, out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against him and prevail. The south immediately attacks the north as a consequence of that. A branch out of her roots. There's Berenice. There's her roots. Ptolemy Philadelphus. There's the branch out of her root. Her brother. He immediately brings an army, Berenice's brother, attacks Syria in a combined land and sea battle. Both the cities of Antioch and Seleucia, port city, both surrender. Laodice is killed. They've got to do that. Immediately execute her and win the war. Verse 8. And they shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods with their princes, all their precious vessels of silver and gold. And he, the king of the south, Ptolemy Euergetes now, shall continue more years than the king of the north. Seleucus Callinicus dies in BC 226. Ptolemy Euergetes dies in BC 221, 5 years later. In verse 9, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. There's the first stage of Daniel chapter. Can you see the detail that's contained in this chapter? Let me tell you this. I've got an NIV study Bible at home, and I've got a copy of Alpes Israel at home, and Brother Thomas in Alpes Israel gives you a verse-by-verse interpretation of Daniel chapter 11. The NIV study Bible in its commentary at the bottom gives you a verse-by-verse interpretation, not as detailed, but much the same, of Daniel chapter 11. They're virtually identical up to verse 35. There is no dispute amongst Christian commentators any Christian commentators of the interpretation of Daniel chapter 11 up to verse 35. How can there be when you've got this level of detail? You've only got to open a history book beside it. Nobody disagrees. That's why Hastings Bible Dictionary says, surely this can't be a prophecy. Surely this was written after the event. Nothing else in Scripture's got this kind of detail. All right, well, what happens next? Well, here's the rest of the chapter. So now we've got down to here. We've done the introduction. We've done the first Syrian war. Well, you can see now there's going to be a continual conflict over the years between the king of the north and the king of the south. And I'm not going to deal with all of these, but you can accept the fact, perhaps, that from verse 10 all the way through to verse 32, we've got a massive conflict between these. Well, I'll just highlight a couple of things for you. Here's an interesting one. Well, what happens here is this. The king of the north tries to conquer Palestine and they fail. The king of the north tries to conquer, Palestine again, and they succeed. The problem is, with the king of the north, he's got a bigger territory, he's got a bigger army, and he's extremely belligerent over time. He runs foul of the emerging empire of Rome. Now, Rome was not an empire, it was just a powerful Italian state, if you like. But Rome often offered its assistance to people who paid money to it, or to people, territories that it might subsequently want to control. Well, the king of the north runs foul of that. He attacks people, Rome supports him, Rome wins and levies upon him a great war reparation. So that a subsequent king of the north, in verse 20 of Daniel 11, a fellow called Seleucus Philopator had to work for 12 years taxing the Seleucid realm to pay the war reparation that Rome levied upon him for the misdemeanours of his forebears. And it says in verse 20 here, Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes, Seleucus Philometor, in the glory of his kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. What happened was that after the debt was paid off, after 12 years, he was poisoned by his prime minister, a fellow called Heliodorus. Neither in anger nor in battle, just that he wanted his job. Drink this. And so it happened, you see, to the word, it happens. Well, you've got a remarkable issue here. Verses 21 to 32 is all about a king of the north called Antiochus Epiphanes. And he hated the Jews. The most notorious, in fact, the most notorious of all the Seleucid kings, absolutely hated the Jews. He attacks Egypt, and he would have won. He gets to the gates of Alexandria, and he would have won, but for the fact that he stopped. You see, Egypt knew, the king of the south at that time knew they were no match for the amassed army of the king of the north. And rather than simply have the conflict and fight the war and lose the war, they appealed to Rome. And here's the remarkable story of what happened. So Egypt appeals to Rome. And you read in verse 30 of this chapter about the ships of Shittim coming against him. Here's the ships of Rome now coming to Egypt to help him. They didn't send an army, they sent a diplomat, a negotiator. And Rome sends in one man, a fellow called Lucius Papilius Lanus. And he meets Antiochus Epiphanes in the front of his army as Antiochus is planning to take Egypt. And now these two knew each other, you see, because these are the kings of the Mediterranean world. So they all knew each other. Antiochus Epiphanes had, in fact, grown up and gone to university in Rome. So he knows Lanus on a first-name basis. And Lanus comes to him and says, hello there, what do you think you're doing? What's the deal with the horsemen and the spears and the archers and the weapons? What's happening? Oh, I'm just going to take that city there. Oh, are you? Well, I'd recommend you reconsider that. Oh, would you? Now, why would that be? Well, because they're the allies of Rome. And you've got to believe that we look after our friends and that if you attack them, you attack us. And we wouldn't want that to happen, would we? And Antiochus Epiphanes says, not very happy with that, Lanus. You shouldn't have said that to me. I'm going to have to go and consult my generals. Lanus says, oh, are you? Well, here's the deal. And he gets a stick and he draws around him in the sand. He says, no problem. Make a decision before you leave the circle. Which gives rise to the modern phrase, a line in the sand. That's where it came from. Well, Antiochus was furious. No way. As one of his predecessors had already paid a large tax when they lost to Rome last time. He can't now attack and take Egypt. So furious, he goes back and offers pigs in the temple in Jerusalem and kills thousands of Jews. He becomes the enemy of the Jews, and that was the cause of it, you see. Remarkable story, actually. That provoked another group of Jews called the Maccabees to immediately begin as guerrilla fighters fighting the king of the north as the king of the north now occupied Palestine. And the Maccabean wars ensued, and the Maccabees would not tolerate a Greek coming in and forbidding them to practice their religion, a Greek coming in and bringing pigs into the temple. And for the most part, the Maccabees were successful in fighting the king of the north and defeating him in their own land. Then you get to verse 36, and this is very important. This is now the rise of Rome. And you know it must be, because look what happens in verse 36. And the king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and so forth. What do we mean, the king? Why isn't it the king of the north or the king of the south? Well, it's very simple, isn't it? Rome controlled everything by the time the Roman Empire got established. Successively over time, Rome they were bequeathed the kingdom of Lysimachus, the second horn of the Greek goat, but by and by they took all 4 divisions of the Greek Empire. And so by the time you get down to verse 36, there is no king of the north or king of the south. or the king of the west, or the king of the far west for that matter. There's only one king. It's the king of Rome. That's who it is in verse 36. He controls everything, you see. But the interesting thing was, Rome had two capitals. And Constantine, as you know, has established a second capital here in Constantinople, the old Byzantium. And it's from here that the Roman army, is going to control all this area, because this is the strongest military bastion that Rome had by the time Constantine had died. The religion would be endorsed from Rome, but the military would be based, for the most part, in Constantinople. Well, this king is the Roman Empire. Now come straight to verse 40, because this is what verse 40 reads like. At the time of the end. Now what's the time of the end? Well, chapter 12, verse 1, at that time when Michael stands up. The time of the end is the time that Christ returns. It's the epoch immediately preceding the establishment of the kingdom of God. The books are opened, end of verse 1, at the time of the end. That is, the resurrection happens at the time of the end. So, as I say, it's the time immediately preceding the establishment of the kingdom. Well, at the time of the end, verse 40 of chapter 11, shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Who's pushing at whom? Well, the king of the south shall push at him. Who's the him? Well, you've got two choices. It's either the king of the north, or it's someone else. Well, who is the him in verse 40? We'll go back to verse 39. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange god whom he shall acknowledge and increase in glory, and he shall... Who's the him or the he of verse 39? Well, the same as the he of verse 38. Who's the he of verse 38? The same as the he of verse 37. Verse 36. Who's the he of verse 36? The king shall do according to his will. And you can circle the word he or his all the way through from verse 36 to 40. It's the Roman who's in control of Constantinople. Because that was the Roman bastion in the east, where these four divisions of the Greek Empire were. So what's the point? The point is that at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, the king of Constantinople. And the king of the north shall come against him, the king of Constantinople, with a whirlwind. That's what. There are three people in verse 40 and not two. There's the king of the south, the king of the north, and him. If you would, the king or the ruler of Constantinople. That's what's happening. The king of the south was last mentioned in verse 29. It was the power controlling the land of Egypt. The him was last mentioned in verse 36. That's the power controlling Constantinople. And the king of the north was last mentioned in verse 30. That's the power controlling Syria or Babylonia. Three powers, the king of the north, the king of the south, and the him, the ruler of Constantinople, of Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. So what's happening here? Well, at the time of the end, at that epoch of time immediately preceding the return of the Lord, the king of the south shall push at Constantinople. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire, which was the empire based around Constantinople, that is the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, 1453 it was overthrown by the Ottoman Turks, who immediately established the Turkish Empire. Turkey, prior to Turkey actually taking Constantinople, they already controlled most of Greece, all of Turkey, Palestine, Egypt. They already controlled. This was the thorn. This was the city that they couldn't take. Well, they brought cannon up against it, and they finally overthrew Constantinople, at which point it became the capital of the Turkish Empire, which basically controlled, for the most part, all the territory of the ancient Greek Empire. Rome in the west still existed because the Holy Roman Empire was alive and well in the west, but now the Turks in their empire controlled, if you would, the Eastern Roman Empire. Well, what happened? Revelation chapter 16 says that Turkey would eventually dry up, and so she did, from about the mid-19th century. Egypt gained independence from Turkey and then adopted a very aggressive attitude towards Turkey. Britain, of course, who was a key player in the Middle East at that time, was forced to intervene, and in 1882, Britain sent troops into Egypt to help maintain the peace. Egypt was rattling the sabre so terribly, you see. Egypt had basically threatened to attack Turkey. Well, they couldn't hope to win that war. They would have lost the war. Britain says, whoa, things are getting out of control. We're going to send men into Egypt to control the peace and settle the ruler down. Not only that, of course, but just before that, in 1875, Britain had become a shareholder in a major asset in Egypt, which was called what? The Suez Canal. The last thing Britain wants is for the ruler of Egypt to attack Turkey, to lose, and then Turkey to take control of the Suez Canal. That's no good. We don't want that. So settle down. We'll help you manage your people. We'll help you manage your anger and get over this problem that you've got with the Turks. And so she did. Well, Britain remained in Egypt until 1954, until they were asked to leave by whom? Abdel Nasser. Because Abdel Nasser preferred the Russians to the Brits. And the Brits liked the Jews, and Nasser didn't like the Jews. So they were asked to leave. But it was during that time, that is the time that Britain occupied Egypt, that the King of the South pushed at him, you see. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, didn't it? Britain had done a lot for Turkey, you know, because they'd helped Turkey in the Crimean Wars against Russia to stop Russia attacking Turkey, for reasons you now understand. The problem was that when the war broke out, Britain and Russia found themselves on the same side, and Turkey, who was forced to enter World War I, had to decide which side they would join. Would they join the Axis with the Germans, or would they join the Allies? The problem with the Allies is that Russia and Britain were both allies. She loved the Brits, she hated the Russians. Did she love the Brits more or less than she hated the Russians? Answer, less. She could not join the side where the Russians were. She just fought 2 Crimean Wars against Russia, so she joins the Germans, instantly making herself an enemy of the British Empire. Gloves are off. Britain will not spare any mercy with Turkey. Well, they try to help Russia by securing a supply line through the Straits, the Dardanelles, and into the Black Sea. It was the Gallipoli landing, which happened here at the bottom of the Sea of Marmara. The Gallipoli landing failed, of course, so what does Britain do? She loses a lot of men at Gallipoli, with the Anzacs, of course. They fail. What does Britain do? Sends all the men straight down here to Egypt, a protectorate of the British Empire, at least up until Abdel Nasser. And from there, they drive up Palestine, they dry up Turkey, all the way up to Turkey. So because of Turkey's folly in siding with the wrong side, she loses Palestine in the battles of World War I. This was a classic invasion of the King of the South. Because what's happened here is that the King of the South has attacked the King of the North and conquered Palestine on the way. That's what's happened in verse 40 of Daniel chapter 11. Now, have a look at this. Here's the mind of Brother Thomas. I'll tell you how significant this is in a moment. Elvis Israel, page 445. The lion power, Britain, will not interest itself in behalf of the subjects of God's kingdom from pure generosity, piety toward God, or love of Israel. Britain's got self-interest, let's be frank. God, who rules the world and marks out the bounds of habitation for the nations, will make Britain a gainer by the transaction. I will bless those that bless thee, I'll curse them that curseth thee. If Britain helps the Jews, they will be the gainer by the transaction. He will bring her rulers to see the desirableness of Egypt, Ethiopia and Sheba, which they will be induced by force of circumstances probably to take possession of. So here's Brother Thomas saying, well, you know, I think Britain's going to go and occupy Egypt. He knew nothing about why Britain would have to do it, because they want to protect the Suez Canal investment, because they want to stop Egypt from attacking Turkey. He reasons that Britain's got to go and occupy Egypt. They will, however, before the Battle of Armageddon, be compelled to retreat from Egypt and Ethiopia. So he foresees the proclamation of Abdel Nasser. He doesn't know it's Abdel Nasser. He just knows that Britain's got to come into Egypt, and then Britain's got to leave Egypt. For the king of the north shall stretch forth his hand upon the land of Egypt, which shall not escape, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. I'm sorry? How does that prove that Britain's got to leave Egypt? What we're saying is, Brother Thomas says, that Britain is going to come into Egypt and then leave Egypt because it says that the king of the north will stretch forth his hand upon the land of Egypt and won't escape. How does that prove that Britain's going to leave Egypt? Well, look at this carefully. It's very important to understand, so if you haven't listened up until now, listen carefully to this. Verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him. Who's the king of the south? Well, it's Egypt. Pushing at Turkey. But it tells you what's more, that in verse 42, he shall stretch forth his hand, the king of the north shall stretch forth his hand upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Here's my question. Why doesn't it say in verse 42 that the king of the north shall stretch forth his hand upon the countries, and the king of the south shall not escape? Because surely it means the same thing. It doesn't mean the same thing. The king of the south is Egypt under the occupation of a foreign power. When the foreign power leaves Egypt, Egypt becomes Egypt and is no longer called the king of the south. The king of the north is Syria and Babylonia under the occupation of a foreign power. Unless they're occupied by the foreign power, they're just Syria or Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan and so forth. You see the difference? So what Brother Thomas picks up here is that in verse 40, the king of the south pushes at Turkey. That means Egypt, under the occupation of a foreign power, will attack him, the ruler of Constantinople, from verse 36. But that foreign power will not forever control the possession of Egypt, because by the Battle of Armageddon, the king of the north comes against Egypt, which is just Egypt, you see? And that's Brother Thomas's point. Before Armageddon, Britain's going to be compelled to retreat from Egypt because the king of the north stretches his hand upon Egypt. He doesn't stretch his hand upon the king of the south. So Egypt is no longer under the control of a foreign power by the time the king of the north takes it. Now, very simple, I think, very clear. What we're saying is that the king of the south is the land of Egypt under the occupation of a foreign power. As soon as the Brits or the Americans or whomsoever leave Egypt to the control of the Egyptians, Egypt becomes Egypt. And the same in the north. Therefore, you read about the king of the south in verse 40 and Egypt alone in verse 42. It's the same geographical territory, but simply under the control of two different powers. What that means, brothers and sisters and young people, is that today, in verse 40, we're sitting on the colon. The king of the south has pushed at him. Stop. That's the year 2013. We're waiting for the king of the north to come against him, Turkey, like a whirlwind. That's yet to happen, you see. Now, who is the king of the north? Who is the king of the north? I'm waiting for the king of the north to come and attack Turkey. Who is this king of the north? Give me the answer in a word, for example, or a couple of words.
Foreign power in control of Syria.
Now, why didn't you say Russia? Because you're reading Daniel 11 and you're not reading Ezekiel 38, right? Why do we say it's Russia? Well, because we look at Ezekiel 38 and we say, it's easy. Ezekiel 38 talks all about a power from the north, hostile to Israel, at the time in the latter days, time of the end, coming against the Israel with all these friends, Persia, Ethiopia, Libya and so forth, interrupted suddenly and is finally destroyed on the mountains of Israel. And we say, well, that's what Ezekiel 38 says. And by the way, it's Russia. It is Russia. There's no problem understanding that. Daniel 11 describes exactly the same kind of battle, the same aggressor, the same battle, the same result, in the same territory. At the time of the end, it must be the same battle. Absolutely right. And we make the parallel between Daniel chapter 11 and Ezekiel chapter 38. Here's the difference. We've got a northern invasion in Daniel 11. We've got a northern invasion in Ezekiel 38. Russia in Ezekiel 38 is presented as a latter-day Assyrian. Russia in Daniel 11 is presented as a latter-day Greek. You see? He's a latter-day version of the Seleucid Empire. That's the difference between Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11, but it is the same battle between the same people on the same territory with the same result. So we're right in saying it's Russia in Daniel 11 and verse 40 as the king of the north, but that's a careless way to say it, but we know what we mean. You just now understand that the king of the north's not just Russia. It might happen to be Russia, but it's actually whoever it is, the person in control of the ancient territory of the Seleucid Empire, which at that time had its capital city in Syria. Now I'll show you something else. There's the king of the north and south. It's a funny thing in the Muslim world, you know. There are two brands of Islam. There's Shia Islam or Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. And the difference between them is that the Sunnis, after Muhammad died, Abu Bakr, who was his best friend and successor, became the caliph after the death of Muhammad. And the Sunnis follow that line and say that the caliph who runs the Muslim world should be the best man suited for the job, whatever his blood descent. The Shiites say, no, that's no good. We want a literal blood descendant of Muhammad. He's the only valid ruler of the Muslim world. And so you can see it splits straight away between the Shiites, who want a direct bloodline from Muhammad, and the Sunnis, who just want the best man for the job. And the best man for the job invariably became the best general of the army, whoever that might be. Well, the world is now, the Muslim world is polarised between Shia and Sunni Muslims. And it's a funny thing. Iran is the capital of Shia Islam. So the degree of the shade of red on this slide is the proportion of Shia Islam. So you can see in Egypt, North Africa, it's overwhelmingly a majority Sunni population. In this part of the Middle East here, and interestingly in Yemen, but particularly here, overwhelmingly Shiite. Now that's interesting because we're lining the world up. It's now polarised between the territory of the king of the north and the king of the south. Egypt was, of course, the old territory of the king of the south. This was the old territory of the king of the north, you see. And already the world has polarised Muslim against Muslim between those two territories. That's the first interesting point. Remember this. This is old news now. If you're under 20 years old, you wouldn't even remember, I suppose. This is the US elections in the year 2000. George Bush was running for his first term in government against Al Gore. Al Gore was the foreign policy representative for Bill Clinton. He travelled all around the world, a great speaker, a great diplomat, shook hands with all the most important people in the world. George Bush, he didn't even have a passport. He'd never left Texas. And if it didn't grow in Texas, did it really exist? And people looked at Bush and said, oh, do we really want this fellow running the country? Well, they have an election, and there's a problem with the voting machines in Florida, and it's coming to the wire, and 50 million people in America are voting, and Bush wins the election by 537 votes. Was he the best man for the job in terms of qualifications? Probably not. Can you see that the American people really wanted Al Gore to win that election, but the angels really wanted George Bush to win that election? And so things started to go wrong, and they counted the votes, and blow me down, in 50 million votes, he wins by a whisker of 537 votes. Now, what was the difference from God's point of view between George Bush and Al Gore? Well, George Bush was a Christian, apparently. And he supported the nation of Israel, apparently. And he didn't like Muslims at all. Well, 9/11 happened. What does George Bush do? Bang, bang. Takes two countries. Like he took, in the space of 18 months, two countries. Now that's interesting. You can see two countries in the red. What do you think that grey area is? That's the area of the ancient king of the north. We've got a problem today here in Syria. We've got, I don't have to tell you, we've also got a looming problem right here in Iran. What are they doing about those nuclear reactors? Do we really want Iran to have an atomic weapon? We've got a big problem today in the territory of the King of the North. And at this point, that's under the control, well, it's under the control of the lawyer Jirga. Who's it really under? They can't govern themselves. The Americans are trying to leave. They're trying to leave Iraq. We're looking at a situation where we would expect these countries here, by the time that Christ returns, prior to the Battle of Armageddon, to be under the control of a foreign power. Why? Because verse 40 of Daniel 11 says, the king of the north shall come against Turkey like a whirlwind. Who is the king of the north? It's not Russia. It's the ruler, the foreign ruler of that territory there. It might happen to be Russia. But you see the point? It's the foreign power in control of that area right there. What will Russia do with that? Well, it's a funny thing, when you read Ezekiel chapter 38. Persia, Ethiopia and Libya with them, says verse 5, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Zagama of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. So here's Russia coming with his confederates. Be prepared, prepare thyself, thou and thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard to them. So Russia says, I need to corral these countries. I'm going to be a guard to them. That is to say, a sentinel, a shepherd, a supervisor. They might have their own governments, but they're puppets. The real power behind those countries when Christ returns will be Russia. So what's going to happen with the Syrian issue? Well, they've probably got chemical weapons. America's threatening this, she's threatening that. It may be that America attacks Syria. It may be that there's an agreement that stops Syria from using them. It may be that they march all the chemical weapons out of Syria. What will eventually happen is that Russia will control Syria. Have you ever noticed that in Ezekiel 38 and all the nations that are mentioned there that come against Israel, Syria is not mentioned? Syria is Israel's oldest enemy. Persia's mentioned. Syria's not mentioned. I think it's entirely possible, brothers and sisters, that Syria is annexed and she loses her power completely. Doesn't even retain an identity. Highly possible, because she's not mentioned as Ezekiel 38, but Persia is, and Russia's a guard to Persia. Very likely that the Assad regime goes completely, therefore, in Syria. Either way, Syria will find itself under the occupation of a foreign power prior to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by a parallel between Ezekiel 38 and Daniel chapter 11, that foreign power will be Russia. Well, what happens? So here comes the king of the north in verse 40. Pushes at Constantinople. That's important. What that means, let me go back to a map. Let me go back to a bigger map. That'll do. Here's the territory of the king of the north. And she's going to push against Constantinople. What that means is that prior to Russia attacking Turkey, she's already got to have the control of all of these countries here. So there's no question Russia will attack Turkey on the way down to Israel. But before she attacks Turkey, she's got to be called the King of the North. Before she can be the King of the North, she has to have control of all of these countries. Well, America's got two hot potatoes in her hand. She's leaking money hand over fist. She's going to have to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Who will she give them to? These countries are unstable. They can't govern themselves. Goodness me, the Americans try and train up troops there and the troops start shooting the Americans. It's red on blue, isn't it? So America's going to exit. Maybe they'll hand them over to the United Nations. One way or other, Russia's going to enter those countries and take control of those countries, including Iran, who should be a guard to, and including Syria, who it appears might lose its identity completely. Russia will become the king of the north by that method. Then she'll take Turkey, then she'll take Palestine. And down she comes in verse 40. Against him, Turkey, like a whirlwind, chariots, horsemen, many ships, entering into the countries and overflowing and passing over. And he shall enter, that is, the king of the north, shall enter the glorious land, into Israel. Many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape, Edom, Moab, Ammon. So she goes down the Palestinian plain on her way to Egypt. He'll stretch forth, verse 42, his hand upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So this is a classic invasion of the king of the north. Palestine is simply a casualty. Her main goal from her capital in Syria is to come down and get Egypt. That's what the king of the north has always done. The king of the north never really cared much about Palestine. She always wanted to take the king of the south, or the territory occupied by him. That's Egypt. Similarly, the king of the south always wanted to fight the king of the north up in Syria. Palestine happened to simply be the trampling ground. You've got exactly the same thing here. From verse 40 onwards, you simply have a latter-day invasion of the king of the north. The main goal is to secure Egypt. It happens that they have to go through Palestine on the way, and you can see here. They enter the land in verse 41. They pass through the land, verse 42, to Egypt. What's the goal that Russia has in mind as she goes into Egypt? Verse 43, to have power over the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt. Now that's interesting, because it tells you, if you just turn the page back to verse 8, it tells you that in this very first conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south, in verse 8 it says that the king of the south was victorious after Laodicea had been killed, and he carried away captives into Egypt, that is from the north, into Egypt, their gods, with all their princes, with their precious vessels of silver and gold. Verse 43 is the reprisal about 2,000 years later. There was a day, you see, or 2,300 years later, there was a day about 200 BC when the king of the south triumphed over the king of the north and took all his precious things down south. Well, finally what you read at the end of Daniel chapter 11 is that the king of the north comes down and he takes all the treasures of gold, silver and the precious things of Egypt and takes them all north. So Daniel 11 in verse 43 is the reprisal in the last days for what happened in Daniel 11 and verse 8 in the very earliest days of the conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. And interesting, there's one very conspicuous phrase in Daniel 11 which always speaks of the king of the north. He's got a characteristic about him that whenever he attacks, this characteristic is always there. And it's almost the last word in verse 40. When the king of the north invades, this is what happens. Verse 40, he overflows. It's like a dam burst. He inundates the land and the area of the south with his troops. He overflows. And if you're taking notes, you might like to note that the word overflow appears in verse 10 of Daniel 11. It appears in verse 22. It appears in verse 26. Verse 10, 22, 26, in successive invasions of the king of the north, he always overflows. What are we saying? We're saying that Daniel 11 from verse 40, what you're simply reading about is a classic invasion once again of the king of the north into Egypt. It's just the same as it's always been. His goal is to take Egypt. He has to pass through Palestine to get it. In this case, he secures Egypt in verse 43. He takes all the treasures, but because of tidings out of the north and east in verse 44, he goes back to plant his tabernacle between the two seas. So Israel's almost an afterthought. His main goal was to go down and secure Egypt, you see. It's a classic end-time invasion of the king of the north. But my point is, before that happens, Russia's got to take control of the ancient Seleucid territory. Then they've got to take control of Turkey, and only then can they come through Palestine on the way to Egypt, take Egypt, and then march back to Palestine to plant their tabernacle. So what we'd expect to see, therefore, from Daniel chapter 11 is another invasion of the king of the north, just as we've seen all the way through this chapter. The king of the south has already invaded and pushed at Turkey in 1917. Britain has left Egypt. There is no longer a king of the south in Daniel chapter 11. It's just Egypt. The king of the north hasn't yet formed. These countries in the old Seleucid territory are still under their own administration, more or less. Russia is not yet a guard to them. That's got to happen first. Then goes Turkey, then goes Egypt, then goes Palestine. That's what Scripture tells us. Pretty clear, I think, pretty consistent based on the previous verses of Daniel chapter 11. So 3 things are going to happen. Syria is going to be occupied. All this posturing, all this rhetoric, all the threats, they don't really matter. The result will be that Syria is occupied by Russia. That is going to be the end result. There's going to be an invasion of the land, and it will be successful. It will be done by the king of the north, who is spearheaded by Russia. And there will be the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, that's never happened. The king of the north fought the king of the south back and forward over Palestine. Christ never intervened. He will this time. Because this, when you read Zechariah 14, threatens the very existence of the land of Israel. So you see, we're living in pretty exciting times. All the countries in the world are lining up to play their part and to read their lines in fulfillment of this prophecy. Christ is coming. We've got to take it seriously, and we've got to do something about it.